Hi, it's Katrina. Today I'm going to share some very strange stories about scientists who mysteriously disappeared or just ended pretty badly. Maybe they knew too much. Maybe they were too curious for their own good. You can be the judge. Peng Jamu. A stone memorial stands in the barren Lop Desert in northwestern China, dedicated to the well-respected biologist Peng Jamu. You might not recognize his name, but he was a pretty big deal in the late 1900s. That is, until he went missing while on an expedition to Lop Nur, a salt lake in the desert that holds many secrets. He wanted to study this body of water, which was sometimes called the Wandering Lake, because it had a habit of shifting its location. He and a team of scientists loaded up their equipment and headed out into the wasteland in 1980. But 5 days into the journey, Peng wandered into the endless sea of sand in search of water and never returned. Peng was an esteemed biochemist who was employed by the Shanghai Institute of Biochemistry and Cell Biology. He wanted to understand how things worked in nature, so he spent most of his time trying to match up what he saw in experiments with how things happened in real life. He also dreamed of exploring the wild edges of his home country, and eventually he got the chance. On his first expedition, he explored the Xinjiang province, along with its unique species, its landscape, and the potassium levels found in its dust bowls. His first trip to the desert took place in 1956. He and a team made up of chemists, biologists, and archaeologists set out on the journey, sparking research in the area that persisted for years. Would you be able to handle it? Searching the desert for things unknown day after day in the hot sun? I don't think so. A year before he vanished, in 1979, Peng was promoted to the vice president of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He wasn't just an ordinary scientist either. He liked to travel by old-fashioned means. I mean, just picture a group of scientists, their lab coats and all, riding around the desert on donkeys. It's funny to think about, but that's exactly what Peng and his team were doing, minus the lab coats, of course. Not all the time, though. They also traveled by canoe and by car when needed, as well as on foot. As Peng once said, science is to walk a road not traveled by other people. On Peng's last trip to Lake Lop Nur, which covers a region 75 miles long and 100 miles wide, he and his team ran into some trouble. On this particular journey, they traveled by car during one of the most brutal times of the year. Their vehicles would often sink into soft riverbeds or shifting sand dunes. They had limited fuel, food, and water, which you think would be the most abundant thing they would pack, but I guess not. So by day 5, things were looking pretty grim. Peng felt like he needed to be the one to make things better for everyone. Maybe they should have drawn straws, but the outcome likely would have been the same. People can go a long time without food, 30 days or more, but water is essential. Nobody can survive more than a few days without it. So Peng, making the ultimate sacrifice for his team, set out in search of some refreshing H2O, and this would be the last thing he ever did. He never returned, and his body was never found. Peng's disappearance rocked the nation. The Chinese government did everything in its power to rescue the biochemist, launching an expansive search effort with help from the police and the military. But years went by and nothing was ever found. Well, that's not exactly true. They did find several mummified skeletons and remains that they subjected to DNA analysis, but none of them ended up being a match to Peng. After he vanished in the desert, theories began to circulate. Since he was an experienced explorer, familiar with the dangers of the Lop's landscape, some people were convinced that his disappearance was no accident. But even Marco Polo described in his journals how easy it is to get lost in the desert, especially when you're dehydrated. Between 1959 and 1996, the Lop Desert was the site of nuclear weapons testing. Some sections of the barren wasteland were still considered restricted military zones, meaning that people weren't allowed to roam around willy-nilly. But Peng seemingly disobeyed orders, setting off on his own. So what if he stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see? Maybe he was taken by the government and sworn to secrecy, living the rest of his life in some underground bunker somewhere. Some believe that he might have defected, or that the Soviets or Americans kidnapped him to gain the knowledge he'd learned while on his his expeditions. Later on, a claim was made by the son of one of the top officials of the Chinese Communist Party. He said that he saw Peng at a restaurant while visiting Washington, D.C., but that was never proven. If the American government was involved in Peng's disappearance, they never confessed. More outlandish theories involving aliens also made their way into the conversation. Throughout the investigation, one of Peng's colleagues came forward and said that Peng had cancer and was terminally ill. He should have been resting and spending time with his family, but instead, he chose to continue his research. In fact, in 1957, he had been diagnosed with a tumor. The people he worked with said he'd recovered from the tumor, but what if the disease had returned? His team claimed that he left that fateful day with nothing but a water bottle and a couple of cameras. So, did he go out into the desert planning to die? Sadly, nobody knows. Dr. Ning Lee. Chinese-American scientist Dr. Ning Lee was undeniably an extraordinary woman. In 1999, she invented an anti-gravity device. Well, her machine didn't exactly modify gravity, but it did produce a gravity-like force that could point in any direction. She was working on things that are typically only thought possible in science fiction movies. But then, not long after, she vanished. In the 1990s, Lee was employed as a research scientist by the University of Alabama's Center for Space, Plasma, and Aeronomic Research. But as the years went on, she felt like the university was holding her back. So she quit her job and formed her very own company called AC Gravity LLC. This company focused on anti-gravity research, one of Lee's passions. She co-authored a series of papers between 1991 and 1993, claiming that she'd come up with a practical way to create anti-gravity effects. Without getting too technical, Lee invented a design for a machine that used rotating ions to create a field that could repel gravity. Her work went on to be published by several newspapers and popular science magazines, sending a shockwave through the scientific world. She should have become famous. She should have made millions from her designs, but neither of those things happened. Upon sharing her research with the world, no discrepancies were found by anyone. Lee kicked open a door that was once thought impossible to open. Imagine her device as the stereotypical tractor beam you'd see in a UFO movie. You know, the one that always seems to be making cows levitate towards the spaceship. When the field created by Lee's machine is aimed at an object, it aligns the ions around the object, allowing it to appear like it was floating in mid-air. Now, for a moment, think about the implications this device could have. Imagine, instead of firefighters using a large net to catch people jumping out of burning buildings, they could shine one of these tractor beams at the person, slowly and safely lowering them to the ground. Or, as NASA scientist Jonathan Campbell pointed out, the machine could be used to produce a sort of force field around the International Space Station, protecting it from orbital debris and small meteoroids. But think on an even bigger scale. Instead of just protecting the ISS, what if this machine could protect the entire planet? These, of course, are all just hypothetical uses that could eventually be possible due to Lee's work. To build her device, she needed a large amount of cash money. She received funding through grants awarded to her by the U.S. Department of Defense in 2001. She was given $448,970 to continue her research. However, the results from this research were never released to the public. Seems suspicious, but okay. After the grant period ended in 2002, she allegedly cut ties with the DoD. She felt like they wanted too much control over the technology that she had invented. So instead, she searched for funding from other investors who were more hands-off. In her own words, she said that the work that she was doing was too important and should belong to all of the American people. She probably didn't want it all to be hidden away and just used by the military. In 2003, after sending her last documented correspondence to her colleagues in a private email, she seemed to vanish off the face of the earth. Several people tried to contact her in the years that followed with no success. In 2004, journalist Tim Ventura sent an email to one of Lee's colleagues, Eugene Podkletnov. He told Podkletnov that he was sending Lee an email every 2 months. He said that he could tell from the return receipts that bounced back that someone was reading his messages, but nobody ever replied. Podkletnov, on the other hand, responded right away. He claimed that Lee was alive and well and was still working with the DoD. though this has never been confirmed by the agency. He said that Lee wasn't allowed to talk about her work and that he was unable to find a working phone number or an email to contact her. Years passed and Lee's whereabouts remained unsolved, sparking several conspiracy theories as to what happened to the anti-gravity scientist. These theories ran wild until 2008, when Jack Sarfati, an American theoretical physicist, gave a rather alarming update on Lee. The full interview was later uploaded to YouTube by the channel Barely Sociable. Sarfati claimed that Lee had stopped working for the DoD and had moved to China to continue her work. He said that she had worked with NASA and the Redstone Arsenal Army base for a few years before going missing. Nobody, not even the Pentagon, could reach her, and nothing about her research was ever published again. So, what really happened to Dr. Ning Lee? According to an article written by Noah Logan, an investigative journalist for the Huntsville Business Journal, he has the answer. He, like many others, became obsessed with solving this mystery. He set out on a quest to find the truth, and he found it. An obituary for Lee was published in July 2021 on the Berry Hill Funeral Home website. It stated that she passed away at 79 years old. It also listed the names of Lee's surviving children, one of whom Noah Logan got in contact with. After an extensive amount of research, Logan found a phone number for a business that was registered under Lee's son's name, George Guan-Yu Men. Logan called the number, and to his surprise, George answered. The two of them set up a meeting, and all of Logan's questions were answered. George said that his mother never talked about her work, not even with her own family. He recalled asking about her research once and was told by Lee, "First off, you don't know anything. Second off, if you even think you might know something, you forget about it." So perhaps someone threatened Lee to keep her mouth shut. George also confirmed that Lee never left the DoD, and he dispelled any rumors of her moving back to China. He did say that in 2008, Chinese officials attempted to recruit her, but apparently Lee had no interest in going with them. She was probably doing some very top-secret, incredibly confidential things for the government. George said that on one occasion, Lee tried to go to China to attend her mother's funeral. However, she was denied permission to do so. But whether that was the DoD telling her no or the Chinese government remains unclear. George explained that his mother changed after leaving the University of Alabama to work in the private sector. Before, she loved publishing her work and sharing her findings with the public. After she was given top-secret clearance, though, she was forbidden from sharing anything about her research with anyone. George confirmed that Lee worked for the Redstone Arsenal Army base until 2014, when she was struck by a vehicle while crossing the street. Sadly, the accident resulted in permanent brain damage that eventually led to Alzheimer's. Lee apparently lived with George, who took care of her until her death on July 27, 2021. The identity of the driver who struck Lee is still a mystery to this day. Some believe that the FBI or CIA could have been involved, but of course that's just a theory. Did Ning Lee know too much? Is it possible that she paid the price for it with her life? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, if you had a brilliant idea and could receive unlimited funding but had to keep it a total secret, would you do it? Or would you keep it for the public? And now for a quick break because it's shout out time. I want to give a big shout out to Byron Thunderwing and M Vaccaro. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family, because why not? Ator Majara. It was March of 1938 when Ator Majara, an Italian theoretical physicist, bought a ticket to travel by ship to Naples. He would never make it onto that ship. In fact, he was never seen or heard from again. Majara was born in Sicily in 1906. From a young age, it was clear that he was mathematically gifted. In 1923, he studied engineering at the University of Rome, but made the switch to physics 5 years later. His intelligence was so impressive that he went on to join a team led by Enrico Fermi, who proposed the famous Fermi paradox. Fermi placed Majara among history's greatest geniuses like Isaac Newton and Galileo Galilei. Think of him on par with Albert Einstein, paving the way in quantum mechanics. Majara worked on neutrino masses. Neutrinos are the fundamental particles in the universe. They are incredibly small and they have little to no mass at all. Neutrinos don't have an electric charge, making them difficult to detect. And because of their lack of charge and mass, they interact with other particles only through gravity and the weak nuclear force. Even that explanation is hard to comprehend. So imagine being one of the scientists who knew everything there was to know about these particles. Ator Majara was one of these scientists. Majorana's work was ahead of its time. In 1937, he even hypothesized the existence of particles that acted as their own antiparticles, known as Majorana fermions. What does that even mean? Well, Newton's third law states that for every action or force in nature, there is an equal and opposite reaction. This law holds true even in the quantum realm. Every particle that exists has an antiparticle attached to it. These antiparticles have the same mass as their counterparts, but they have an opposite charge. When a particle and its antiparticle collide, they basically annihilate one another, creating energy in the process. And from that energy, new particles, like photons, are created. It's important to go over the research Majorana was working on to fully grasp the impact his disappearance had on the scientific community. He hypothesized that Majorana fermions could exist, but he vanished before he was able to prove it. If he hadn't gone missing, the realm of quantum mechanics could be years ahead of what it is now. Think of planets that orbit each other. Over time, the gravity holding the planets apart begins to weaken, and eventually the two planets collide. The planets are obliterated, and any life that existed on them is wiped out. But nothing can be fully destroyed. From the collision, matter is ejected into space like large chunks of rock that become space debris, and hiding on some of that debris would be traces of the fundamental building blocks of life: oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and hydrogen. Those building blocks could eventually create new forms of life over millions of years. Just like the collision between particles and antiparticles creates new particles. It was only in 2020 that MIT observed evidence of this elusive particle. It doesn't 100% prove that they exist, but we are getting closer and closer to it being a real possibility. Okay, so what happened to Ator Majara? He left Italy in 1933 on a grant from the National Research Council and headed to Germany to continue his research. There, he worked alongside Nobel Prize winner Niels Bohr. He also further developed Werner Heisenberg's theory of the nucleus, which we won't go into detail about now. Things seem to be looking up for Majorana. Before he even reached his prime, he had worked with some of the greatest minds in the world. But in the fall of 1933, his health began to deteriorate, so he returned to Rome. He had developed acute gastritis while in Germany, inflammation in the lining of the stomach. He also suffered from nervous exhaustion, likely from his habit of working late into the night and getting little sleep. He was put on a strict diet by his doctor, and during this time, he became a recluse. He no longer had a close relationship with his family. He even passed on vacations that he and his mother took every summer. As the days went on, he retreated more into himself, appearing less and less at the Naples Physics Institute where he worked. He barely left his house at this point, essentially becoming a hermit before the age of 30. For almost 4 years, he barely published any of his work and shut himself off from his friends and relatives. His last published paper was released in 1937. This work held his predictions on the Majorana fermions, as I mentioned before. He seemed to come out of his shell a little after that, taking a full-time position as a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Naples. But this would be the last year anyone would hear from him. On March 25th, 1938, Majorana bought a ticket for a boat trip to Naples. Before that, he allegedly withdrew all the money from his bank account. He planned to visit a friend, physicist Emilio Segre, in Palermo before he left. However, Segre was in the US at the time. On the day he went missing, Majorana sent a handwritten note to the director of the Naples Physics Institute, Antonio Carelli. In the letter, he said, "I made a decision that has become unavoidable." He begged Carelli for his forgiveness, mentioning his upcoming disappearance. Majorana also asked Carelli to remember him and pass down everything he'd learned to his students. Can you imagine what must have been going through Carelli's head while he read this letter? After that, nobody ever saw Majorana again. He simply vanished without a trace. It's unknown if he ever made it to Naples or if that was just a cover for where he was really going. It seems like he wanted to disappear and that it was a choice that he had made for himself. His body was never found, so for all anyone knows, he could have lived out the rest of his life in solitude, out of the public eye. But maybe that wasn't the case. Several theories have been proposed over the years regarding his whereabouts after 1938. Some believe he emigrated to Argentina or Venezuela. Others think he retired and spent his last days in a monastery. Then, of course, there are the more sinister stories. Some have speculated that Majara was kidnapped or murdered in order to stop his participation in the construction of an atomic weapon. This seems plausible given the fact that he was a genius, but there is no evidence that this was the case. Some think that the note sent to Antonio Carelli shortly before his disappearance wasn't written by Majara, but instead was written by the hands of those who got rid of him. There were some claims that he had been seen in Venezuela between 1955 and 1959, but there is no concrete evidence to prove that. There were a few photographs that emerged that some believe showed Majara in South America during this time, but it's impossible to know if the man in the pictures was really him. All of these theories are just that, theories. Nobody knows the true fate of Ator Majara, and to this day, it's a mystery that has yet to be solved. What do you think happened to Majara? Let me know in the comments below. Vladimir Alexandrov. If you've ever seen a post-apocalyptic movie of what the world would be like following a devastating nuclear war, you've most likely heard of the term nuclear winter. Smoke would rise into the atmosphere from the countless fires started by the explosions. Black clouds of toxic fumes from industrial facilities would blanket the skies, shutting out the sun. The years that followed would be lifeless and cold. Plants would simply refuse to grow, resulting in mass starvation over most of the globe. And the ozone layer, which protects us from harmful ultraviolet radiation, would shrink. This would essentially turn any survivors into mutated versions of themselves, causing them to get sick and eventually die. The mathematical model for the nuclear winter theory was conceived by Ukrainian physicist Vladimir Alexandrov. It describes the climate effects that would result from nuclear fallout. He proposed this possible scenario in 1983, just 2 years before he vanished into thin air. But not everyone believed in his theory, or maybe I should say that not everyone wanted to believe that a nuclear winter could happen. He was last seen attending the Second International Conference of Nuclear-Free Zones in Spain on March 31, 1985. But nobody knows what happened to him after that. You might be wondering, how could someone even come up with such a theory? Well, Alexandrov allowed computer simulations to do the work for him. He showed off his work at the conference, and the results of these simulations were enough to convince US climatologists to collaborate with him. His international contacts and his prominence in the field of physics made him the perfect advocate for the peace movement. The Cold War lasted from 1947 to 1991. It was a period of geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, as well as their respective allies. It was called the Cold War because no large-scale conflicts directly occurred between the two superpowers. But that doesn't mean that either of them stopped developing weapons of mass destruction. There was no real war going on, but everyone felt that at any moment the whole world could erupt into chaos. Schools across the globe would participate in regular duck and cover training. Children would hide under their desks when instructed to as a standard response to potential nuclear attacks. But this was the very thing that Alexandrov wanted to prevent. He thought by sharing his mathematical model of nuclear winter, countries would start working together to prevent such a scenario. And it worked, for the most part. Nobody has dropped any nuclear bombs on unsuspecting civilians since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. But a new war has cropped up between Ukraine and Russia in the last couple of years, with several other countries now showing support for one side or the other. But that's a story for another day. What you want to know are the mysterious circumstances leading up to Alexandrov's disappearance. He was known to love alcohol, maybe a little too much. During his trip to Spain in 1985, this was made evident to pretty much everyone who saw him. The entire time he was in the country, he seemed to be in a permanent state of drunkenness. Even on the night of the nuclear conference, he had to be picked up off the sidewalk as he couldn't stand on his own. He was then reportedly taken back to his hotel room in Madrid, where he kept the party going. He continued to drink and was seen stumbling between a nearby bingo hall and his hotel. Just hearing about this makes me feel hungover. You'd think that the next morning he would have been passed out in his bed, shielding his eyes from the rising sun. But that's not what happened. When envoys from the Russian embassy came knocking on his door the next day, nobody answered. And when they were finally able to get inside his hotel room, he was nowhere to be found. Some think that he could have escaped to the west, but this possibility was ruled out. The prime suspects in his disappearance were initially the intelligence services, first the KGB and then the CIA. On one occasion, while he was still sober in Madrid, he was allegedly approached by embassy staff. But Alexandrov was doing quite well for himself in the USSR. At the time, he was the lead researcher at the Informatics Center in Moscow, and they allowed him to travel wherever he wanted without intervention. They even let him stay in contact with scientists at the National Laboratory in California. He had a rather cushy life in the USSR, and he and his family were well taken care of. So the notion that the KGB was involved was eventually dismissed. The CIA was also thought to be involved at some point. They clearly had something to gain by making Alexandrov disappear. The Ukrainian physicist had access to powerful American-made supercomputers, and anyone using these devices was heavily monitored by the agency. Then there's the fact that he was an activist for the anti-nuclear movement, and as we all know, wars are a money machine. Maybe the CIA took him out in order to squash the peace campaign and to send a message to anyone else who advocated for peace. But that belief dissipated when no hard evidence was found to conclude that America was involved. Some thought that after some time, Alexandrov would pop back up in the West, or maybe in Italy. But it's now been 30 years, and still nobody knows what happened to him. Is it possible that his nuclear winter theory landed him in some hot water, and maybe even led to him being killed? Unfortunately, until further evidence is presented, his disappearance remains a mystery. Thomas Much. After reaching the summit of Mount Nun, Thomas A. Much must have been on a high. But that high soon came crashing down as he slipped and fell during his descent. He landed in a snow-filled crevice, which you think would feel like falling on a cloud. But Much twisted both of his ankles, suffered a head injury, and then fell unconscious. Thomas A. Much was an American geologist and planetary scientist. He had an accomplished career, working as a professor at Brown University and serving as the Associate Administrator for Space Science at NASA. He was even in charge of the Viking surface photography team. You know, the space probes that landed on Mars? He saw some of the first pictures taken on the Red Planet before anyone else. Commenting on those photographs, he is quoted as saying, "This is just an incredible scene. It looks safe and very interesting." Much was also a bit of an adrenaline junkie. He set out to reach the 23,000-foot peak of Mount Nun in the Kashmir Himalayas in 1980, with 32 of his students and colleagues. It was a group effort. He reached his destination, but we all know what happened after that. On October 5th, 2 of his travel buddies pulled him out of the crevice he'd fallen in. He was battered and bruised, but he was still alive, just unconscious. Surely his companions didn't want to leave him on the mountain. However, there was no way they could get him to safety without risking their own lives. So they made a makeshift shelter to protect him from the elements and started making their descent. They planned to bring back help, but things didn't exactly go as planned. When they returned to rescue Much, he was gone. They searched the area but couldn't find him. Officials believe that at some point, Much regained consciousness and found himself alone. Maybe he panicked and tried to climb down the mountain himself, thinking he'd been abandoned by his comrades. But with 2 sprained ankles and a head injury, it's unlikely that he would have been able to reach the bottom. The general consensus is that Much attempted to get to safety but slipped and fell a second time, perhaps landing in another gorge. Search and rescue teams were sent out to look for his body, but with the conditions on Mount Nun, with snow covering every nook and cranny, locating his remains proved extremely difficult. This would have been one of the worst ways to go. Before succumbing to the elements, Much would have experienced every symptom of hypothermia. His breathing would have become shallow and slow, and his pulse would start to weaken. He would have become drowsy and disoriented, shivering in the snow as he had no way out of it. Plus, he would think that all of his friends and colleagues had abandoned him. Then, at some point, he would have lost consciousness again, closing his eyes for the last time. But that's only if he initially survived the second fall. For all anyone knows, he could have died the second he reached solid ground. That's a lot easier to accept than him slowly freezing to death. When his body couldn't be located, his life was memorialized. NASA Administrator Robert Frost announced in 1981 that the Viking 1 lander would be renamed the Much Memorial Station. A stainless steel plaque with his name engraved on it was then added to the lander. So not only will Much be remembered here on Earth, but he'll be remembered by the future inhabitants of Mars. What a legacy! Jungle cannibals. Fiji was traditionally avoided by European adventurers. For a long time, it was simply known as the Cannibal Isles. Thomas Baker, a Methodist reverend and explorer, saw firsthand just how dangerous this place was when he moved to the country in 1859. Baker survived on Fiji until July of 1867, when he decided to try and make contact with a local chief of an isolated village called Nabu Tautau. He planned to convert the chief to Christianity. The tribe lived deep within the jungle on the country's main island, so getting there was no easy task. But Baker made it, only to suffer a gruesome fate at the hands of these indigenous people. When he arrived, Baker presented the chief with a gift, a comb. He hoped this simple token would serve as a friendly icebreaker. But did he really think a comb would somehow convince the chief to praise God? Apparently so. The chief accepted the gift and he agreed to speak with Baker. However, he flat out refused to convert to Christianity. Baker was insulted by this refusal, and he no longer felt that the chief was worthy of his offering. So he snatched his comb back, but in the process, he grazed the chief's head. And that's when things turned from bad to worse. In the eyes of the tribe, touching the chief was seen as a threatening and insulting act. It's unclear what exactly happened next, but one thing is certain. Baker was killed along with 7 followers he'd brought with him. It's said that they were eaten by the village people of Nabu Tautau. But this story isn't entirely unique. Baker wasn't the only explorer throughout history to go missing and be eaten by cannibals. Giovanni da Verrazzano, an Italian explorer, suffered the same fate in 1528. He was sailing around the Caribbean when he spotted an island near Guadalupe. His men stayed on the main ship as he took a rowboat to go check out the landmass. It's said that as he reached the shore, his crew looked on helplessly from a distance as he was murdered and then eaten by the island's inhabitants. One more story stands out as we discuss explorers going missing and being killed, whether they may have deserved it or not. And that's the tale of Percy Fawcett. In all honesty, it's a mystery what happened to Fawcett, but there have been rumors that he was killed by a tribe while looking for a city of gold in the Brazilian jungle. In 1925, Fawcett and his son Jack, as well as another companion, Raleigh Rimmel, set out to find the legendary lost city of Z. However, none of them were ever seen or heard from again. Fawcett carried a jade statue of a human with him on the journey, believing that it had some type of supernatural powers over Amazonian tribes. He thought that if he showed the statue to the natives, he would have an irresistible power over them. It's clear from Thomas Baker's story that sometimes indigenous tribes can take offense to things, and rightly so. So maybe the Amazonian tribes Fawcett made contact with saw the little jade statue as an insult, and maybe as a result, they killed him and gobbled him up. Thanks for watching! Do you think the real fate of some of these scientists has been covered up? Let me know in the comments below. And let me know what other topics you'd like to see in the future.
Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed. Cheyenne Klaus. According to the DuPage County Sheriff's Office, Cheyenne Klaus was last seen by her family on November 27, 2017, at her home in Downers Grove, Illinois. 2017 was extremely hard on 22-year-old Cheyenne. She watched her mother slowly pass away from liver failure. The two were very close. Not long after her mother died, Cheyenne also lost her beloved dog she's had since she was young, and the experience and pain of so much loss sent Klaus spiraling into a deep depression. A lot of people around her did their best to cheer her up, including a 38-year-old man named Brian Biddle. The two would often drink and go out together. On December 1st, 2017, Cheyenne met with Brian to go to a party. Just after sunrise the next day, she started texting her good friend Chad Chanapai and asked him to pick her up. There were multiple panicked texts from her to Chad about her needing a ride, in addition to some asking why he wasn't responding quickly. When Chad finally texted back, the messages stopped. He reached out to Brian, who claimed he had been asleep for 18 hours, and Cheyenne was gone when he woke up. She didn't have a car or money for a ride. She disappeared, and no one has seen her since. She was officially reported missing by her father on December 12, 2017. 12 days after she vanished, a call to 911 was made from her phone. When the operator asked who it was, the line was quiet, and then whoever it was just hung up. Police believe the call was placed to throw off the investigation. The location of the call was pinged 18 miles from her home near a lake. Authorities and cadaver dogs went through the area, but nothing was found. Brian Biddle and Chad Chanapai are not considered persons of interest in the case, and both have been very cooperative. Cheyenne Klaus is still missing, and there is no viable evidence to help solve what happened to her. Peculiar paranoia. The 2014 vanishing of Lars Mittank became known as the most famous disappearance on YouTube. The video circulated worldwide, garnering tens of millions of views. Surveillance footage showed the 28-year-old fleeing from Bulgaria's Varna airport and into a nearby forest. Mittank, who was from northern Germany, and his friends had traveled to Bulgaria for a vacation. The trip went off without a hitch, minus a brawl that Mittank got into with some men, resulting in an ear injury that required him to stay behind for a few days after his friends all flew home. During that time, Mittank stayed in a hotel near the airport, at one point calling his mother in fear of his life. He told her that someone was following him and wanted to kill him. He also asked her to cancel his bank cards. It's believed that he left the hotel in the middle of the night, but where he went is a mystery. Thankfully, he arrived safely at the airport the next morning. An airport doctor tasked with medically clearing Mittank to fly reported that he was extremely nervous and suspicious of the antibiotic he had been prescribed for his injury. Suddenly, he jumped to his feet and fled the room, saying, "I don't want to die here, I have to get out of here." He left behind his belongings, including his wallet, ID, cell phone, and luggage. There are many theories as to what may have happened to him. Did Mittank run off into the woods and commit suicide, or experience a fatal medical emergency? Did someone steal his organs and kill him and leave him for dead, or perhaps kidnap him into a human trafficking operation? Did he make the wrong people angry, or have a mental breakdown? Nobody knows, or if they do, they aren't talking. Police and a private investigator both failed to turn up any concrete leads regarding Mittank's whereabouts or fate. New hope was brought to the case in 2020 when photos of a homeless man in Dusseldorf bearing an uncanny resemblance to Mittank began circulating on social media, but suspicions of the man's identity remain unverified. A mysterious reappearance. Sometimes a missing person reappears under circumstances that are just as strange, if not even more so, than when they vanished. This was certainly the case for Anton Pilipa, a Canadian activist who disappeared in 2012 while awaiting trial for weapons and assault charges. Pilipa's family searched for him for 5 heart-wrenching years. Nobody had any idea what might have happened to him or where he might be. Then, in December 2016, Brazilian police in the state of Rondônia spotted Pilipa walking barefoot along a road over 6,500 miles away from the home he disappeared from, wearing dirty clothing and sporting a long, disheveled beard. He had no ID or passport on him, but a dedicated officer managed to get to the bottom of the situation with the help of foreign embassies. Anton was taken to a hospital where he escaped shortly thereafter, but authorities found him again and took him back for medical treatment. His family was shocked. They immediately flew down to reunite with him, suspecting that he had been suffering mental problems, particularly schizophrenia, before vanishing. According to the story, he made it to Brazil almost entirely on foot, somehow crossing through 10 countries without proper identification and surviving off nature and the generosity of others. He eventually reached the National Library of Buenos Aires in Argentina, which ironically turned him away for having no ID. Then Pilipa trekked 800 miles into the Amazon jungle before police found him. While Pilipa's brother, Stefan, admits that the timing of his disappearance indicates that he was perhaps running from the law, he does not believe this was the reason Anton went missing. Shortly after he was found, he was reportedly happy to be reunited with his family and doing remarkably well, despite having to answer for his criminal charges from 2012. Some people suspect that there's more to the story behind Pilipa's disappearance, especially considering the difficulties associated with crossing borders without a passport and surviving in the Amazon. but these claims remain unproven. Do you believe his story, or do you think there's more to it? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button for more true crime and mysterious disappearances. A lifelong lie. Is it possible for someone to not realize that they are a missing person? As unlikely as it seems, yes. When Bridgeport, Connecticut resident Nettie Nance became pregnant as a teenager, she was required to provide her birth certificate as part of the approval process for affordable health care. Nettie's mother, Ann Petway, was reluctant to give her daughter the document. But the clock was ticking on Nettie's pregnancy, and she knew she needed to see a doctor. So Nettie searched through her mother's things and found documents with her name and birth date on it. Yet the Office of Vital Statistics was unable to find her birth certificate. A few days later, her mother Ann sat Nettie down and told her that her real mother had abandoned her shortly after birth. But her story didn't add up, sparking Nettie's years-long search to figure out who she really was. She eventually learned that her birth name was Carlina White, and that she was kidnapped from a Harlem hospital in 1987, after her young parents, Joy White and Carl Tyson, took her to the emergency room with a fever. Carlina was kept overnight and disappeared in the early morning hours. Petway, who had lurked around the hospital for months disguised as a nurse, blended in with real staff members, successfully eluding authorities. She spent time in prison years later, after Nettie's exhaustive search led her to her biological parents, sparking a media frenzy and a high-profile criminal case that made international headlines. Nettie's relationship with her parents, all of them, has been complicated over the years, and she struggled with being thrust into the spotlight during such a hectic time in her life. She is reportedly in touch with both Petway and her birth mother and is living a private life, avoiding the unwanted publicity that came with the case. Cult disappearance. 25-year-old Tim Carney vanished in September 2004. He was last seen alive by his roommate at their Butler, New Jersey apartment. He contacted his employer to let them know he was running late to work, but he never arrived, and his car was found abandoned on a roadside along the border between Elizabeth and Newark. He was officially missing. Tim's parents spent painful years looking for their son with no luck. In the time leading up to his disappearance, Tim became increasingly involved with a seemingly extreme religious faction known as the Gospel Outreach. His family became concerned that the group might be controlling his decisions and behavior when two members accompanied Tim to the hospital to visit his aunt because they allegedly thought he was lying about where he was going. But there was little the Carneys could do about their suspicions. Tim was an adult who legally had every right to distance himself from his family if that's what he wanted to do, and even join a cult. He was actually found alive and well in 2011, and unfortunately had no interest in reconnecting with his heartbroken loved ones. Tim's location was kept concealed from the public, and although his family knows where he is, all they can do is hope that he will someday voluntarily re-enter their lives. While Tim's motives for engineering his disappearance and leaving his car on the side of the road remain unknown, many still speculate that the Gospel Outreach has something to do with his refusal to speak to people from his past. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Murder victim found alive. In Germany in 1984, 24-year-old computer science student Petra Pazicka disappeared after a dentist appointment. She also failed to show up to her brother's birthday party, which really concerned her parents, prompting a massive but unsuccessful search. A suspect eventually came forward and confessed to killing and assaulting Pazicka, but he recanted his story. Petra's body was never found, leaving a huge question mark on her disappearance for years to come. She was legally declared dead 5 years later in 1989. Then, in 2015, over 30 years after Petra vanished, Dusseldorf police responded to a burglary call at a 55-year-old woman's home and had trouble confirming her identity. For 31 years, Petra had managed to live in obscurity with no social security card, driver's license, passport, or bank account. Petra gave no reason for why she voluntarily vanished, but told law enforcement she did not want any contact with the public or with her family. All signs point toward the woman carefully planning her disappearance, saving up money ahead of time, renting an apartment under an alias, and paying for everything in cash. By the time police caught up with her, Petra had spent over 3 decades under a different name. Her family reportedly continues to hold out hope that she will eventually reunite with them, but she hasn't tried yet. Why do you think this happens? Why would a college student want to disappear? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Mother-daughter disappearance. During a supervised visit during a bitter divorce and child custody battle in 1994, Dorothy Lee Barnett took her 11-month-old daughter, Savannah Todd, and fled Charleston, South Carolina. Their disappearance initiated an international manhunt. She would later claim that her estranged, abusive husband, Benjamin Harris Todd III, had unfairly won custody of Savannah by lying in family court, leaving her with no choice but to flee for the sake of keeping her daughter safe. The pair spent time in Germany, France, Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, and Botswana before ultimately ending up in Queensland, Australia. Along the way, Barnett married and changed her name to Alex Geldenhuys, and also changed her daughter's name. During her many years on the run and under FBI scrutiny, Barnett was framed as bitter, mentally ill, and perhaps even dangerous. She got a chance to tell her side of the story when law enforcement finally caught up to her in 2013. Geldenhuys was deported to the United States, where she served 2 years in prison for abducting Savannah almost 20 years earlier. Savannah remained in Australia, but stood by her mother, who she said must have had good reasons for abducting her. She eventually reunited with her father, but said the meeting was awkward, with just a handshake instead of a hug. Geldenhuys apparently wants to return to Australia to witness the birth of her grandchild, but is having issues gaining approval of a visa due to so-called character reasons. Dead woman walking. In 1970, Lula Cora Hood walked away from her life in Illinois after a family fight and never looked back. She left behind her 3 children, whom her sister had adopted when Hood struggled to care for them. Her family searched unsuccessfully for her, and in 1996, a human skeleton matching Hood's petite frame was found in an abandoned brickyard in East Galesburg, Illinois. Police held on to the remains, believing they might belong to Hood, in anticipation of improved DNA technology, and the family even held a memorial service. Things took a wild turn when in 2008, DNA testing proved that the bones did not belong to Hood after all, but to someone else. The decades-old missing persons case was reopened, and in 2011, internet searches led investigators to a Jacksonville, Florida woman with the same social security number and first name as Hood. DNA testing confirmed that the woman was indeed Hood, who was 84 years old with a fading memory. She did not remember the first 3 children out of the 14 that she eventually had, but was still happy to reconnect and expressed an interest in traveling to Illinois to meet her grandchildren. Hood's relatives seemed to harbor no bitterness toward the woman for running off so many years before, presumably to escape an abusive situation, and were equally eager to make up for lost time. I think the craziest thing about this story is the 14 children. What about you? Leaving it all behind. Michelle Whitaker was last seen alive at a truck stop in Spartanburg, South Carolina in 2002. She had just served a short jail stint for drunk driving. The Waffle House waitress had a somewhat troubled past, involving alcohol abuse and a volatile relationship with her family, but they couldn't imagine that she would deliberately leave her life and her beloved dog behind. Efforts to find Michelle proved futile. In August 2005, police received an anonymous letter stating that Michelle had been murdered and that her body had been dumped in a specific location, but this was never confirmed. The police investigated numerous tips, but years went by with the case remaining unsolved. Then, in 2008, Michelle was found alive and well in Oregon. She had been living under her own name. A neighbor recognized her on a missing persons website and called law enforcement. Michelle didn't seem to know that her 6-year disappearance had sparked a massive missing persons investigation on the other side of the country. She had simply abandoned her troubled life to start anew. She had not contacted her family due to misunderstandings stemming from her tense relationship with them. Thankfully, Michelle and her family reconnected and healed their broken relationship, perhaps making this story the only one on today's list that has a happy ending. Lynn Bradley. While on a cruise with her family aboard the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line's Rhapsody of the Seas, a 23-year-old Virginia woman named Lynn Bradley vanished into thin air. It was 1998, and the vessel was traveling from Aruba to Curaçao in the Netherlands Antilles when Amy was last seen in the early morning hours of March 24th. She and her brother returned to their cabin around 3:30 a.m. after attending the ship's disco. Her father saw her asleep at around 5:30 a.m., but when he came back about 30 minutes later, she was gone along with her lighter and cigarettes. Cruise passengers spotted the young woman riding the elevator to the top deck. Amy's family realized she was missing shortly after and alerted the ship's staff before docking in Curaçao, asking employees not to let anyone off the ship until Amy was found. Staff apparently ignored the request, and it's unknown whether Amy disembarked and if she did so willingly. It's unlikely that Amy fell or was thrown overboard because the vessel was extremely close to shore when she disappeared, and her remains would have undoubtedly turned up during the extensive Coast Guard search that ensued. But it's also unlikely that she disappeared willingly, as friends and family said that she seemed very happy with her life and was having a great time, with no signs of depression. Since then, there have been numerous unconfirmed sightings of Amy throughout the Caribbean. Most of them are related to brothels, leading her family to wonder if she was, and perhaps still is, being trafficked. Several witnesses described Amy's tattoos and other physical characteristics that were not listed in her missing persons information. Some reports, including one from a former U.S. Navy sailor who visited a brothel, claimed that Amy approached, identified herself, and asked for help before being forcefully led away by strange, aggressive-looking men. He never reported it because he didn't want to face disciplinary action. Other tourists have reported seeing her on the beach, in a store bathroom, always accompanied by men. In 2005, photos surfaced of an alleged sex worker in the Caribbean bearing an uncanny resemblance to Amy. Her family believes it's her in the pictures, and law enforcement has not ruled out the possibility. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to find her. All things considered, it's quite possible that Amy is still alive. The FBI is offering a $25,000 reward for information leading to her recovery. Rico Harris. Los Angeles native Rico Harris enjoyed a short-lived semi-professional basketball career with the Harlem Globetrotters. After just a month, injuries forced him off the court. His luck took another downturn in the early 2000s when he struggled with drug and alcohol addiction and the legal problems that often come with these issues. Thankfully, Rico managed to get clean and stayed clean for 7 years. In 2014, he moved to Seattle to live with his girlfriend, Jennifer Song. Just when it seemed like the young man's life was finally getting on track, his entire existence was derailed. One day in October 2014, not long after admitting to Jennifer that he had relapsed, Rico told her that he was going to explore downtown Seattle and instead drove to LA to visit his family. His mother could tell something wasn't right when her son arrived and assumed that he had been drinking. Rico spent just 1 day in LA and did not sleep the entire time before hitting the road back to Seattle. He called Jennifer and his mother while driving, and the two became concerned about his mental state, knowing he'd been awake for at least 40 hours. The last time anyone heard from Rico was early the next morning, when he told Jennifer he was getting gas in Sacramento. His abandoned car was found at an isolated rest area in Yolo County Regional State Park. It was out of gas and the battery was dead. Even more strange, Rico's cell phone and backpack were discovered along the side of the road 70 miles away. His car and belongings showed no signs of foul play, but the phone contained a strange video of Rico ripping and throwing things in his car shortly before his disappearance, serving as alarming evidence of his disturbed mental state at the time. People reported credible sightings of Rico, but all tips led to dead ends. No trace of the man himself was ever found, despite an extensive search, and authorities admittedly remain baffled about Rico's disappearance. Jennifer has cooperated with the investigation and assisted in the efforts to find her missing boyfriend and is not considered a suspect. April Beth Pitzer. In 2004, 30-year-old April Beth Pitzer moved from Arkansas to Newberry Springs, California. The married mother of 2 told her family that she worked as a waitress, but they later learned that April was living on the street and in and out of homeless shelters, and that she wasn't taking her medication for bipolar disorder. April worked as a caregiver and was trying to get on her feet when she abruptly announced that she was returning to Arkansas. She was last seen on June 28, 2004, when someone picked her up to take her to the bus station. It's unclear whether April ever even boarded the bus, and the troubled woman was never seen again. A friend reported her missing the following month. However, her mother suspected foul play since she had acted as an informant in a federal case that sent someone to prison prior to her disappearance. Several of April's belongings, along with a bloody mattress, were found in a mine shaft the following year. They were worn by the elements, however, and offered no valuable DNA evidence. Authorities painstakingly searched for April, inspecting mines throughout the region, but never found her. To this day, there are no suspects in the case. and although April's mother believes she was murdered, there is no solid evidence that she is even dead. John Michael Spira. On February 23, 2007, a successful 45-year-old businessman and licensed pilot named John Spira met with his estranged wife Suzanne to discuss the terms of their divorce settlement. He then went to his West Chicago, Illinois office, where he was last seen around 7 o'clock in the evening. John never showed up for dinner with a friend, despite confirming the plans shortly beforehand over the phone. His girlfriend attempted to report him missing, but because she's not a relative, police refused to take the report. The man's car was found outside his office, and his phone remained active in the area until 11 p.m. the night he disappeared. Suzanne, the soon-to-be ex, filed a missing persons report 2 days after John vanished, and their divorce was finalized shortly after. John and his wife lived together throughout their divorce proceedings, but allegedly parted on amicable terms. Around the time he disappeared, employees of the business he owned reported that an industrial roll of plastic went missing from the workplace, but it's unknown whether this has anything to do with John's disappearance. His business mysteriously burned to the ground later that year. Investigators found nothing suspicious, but John's family suspects that the blaze somehow relates to his disappearance, and his sister believes that Suzanne, who passed away in 2010, had a hand in these events. John's credit cards and identity have not been used since he vanished, no signs of foul play have been found, and there are no suspects named in the case, leaving detectives to wonder if he abandoned his life voluntarily and started over as someone else. Interestingly, earlier this year, detectives took a fresh look at the case and issued a public notice urging anyone who invested money with John to contact them. Marilyn Renee Nicole McCown. Marilyn Renee Nicole McCown, who went by Nikki, was last seen at a laundromat in Richmond, Indiana on July 22, 2001. Surveillance footage shows the 28-year-old leaving the establishment in her vehicle, seemingly in a calm state, although she had mentioned to her mother earlier that day that some men harassed her at the business. Nikki, a bride-to-be with a young daughter from a previous relationship, never returned home. Her fiancé tried returning his wedding band, which Nikki had purchased, and sought refunds for expenses related to their upcoming wedding, claiming he needed the money to buy a cell phone and fund the search for Nikki. He reportedly failed a lie detector test, raising the alarm that he may have been involved, but he disputes these claims. More details slowly came to light, including Nikki's recent affair with a man named Tommy Swint, who became a police officer after she vanished. He resigned 2 months into the job when his superiors learned he was a suspect in the case. Swint was actually later indicted in another woman's murder, but committed suicide before authorities could arrest him, taking any details of his possible involvement in Nikki's disappearance to the grave. Nikki's vehicle was found several months after she disappeared in the parking lot of an Ohio apartment complex. She had lived at the building years before with an ex-boyfriend who still resided there, and Nikki had called him the day she went missing. The car showed signs of tampering, yet her folded laundry was still in the back seat. The only proven fact about this case is that there were several suspects, but her case may remain unsolved. Jeremy Carl Bert. On February 11, 2007, U.S. Navy veteran Jeremy Carl Bert left his father's Boise, Idaho home to visit a friend, but never arrived. His ex-wife, Kim George, received a text message from Jeremy shortly thereafter, stating that he was starting a new life. Kim suspected that the message was not really from Jeremy and discovered later that day that one of her cars was missing. 3 months later, the vehicle was found abandoned in the remote desert in southwest Idaho. Before he vanished, Jeremy had an affair with his divorce attorney, Jeannie Braun. During that time, he secretly recorded conversations with her regarding illegal activity that she was involved in. He later testified against Braun in court, and the recordings were used as evidence against the lawyer, who was consequently disbarred and sentenced to a year in prison. It remains unclear whether Braun was involved in Jeremy's disappearance, but she claimed the two were not in contact for several months before he went missing. Evidence points to the contrary, however, and the results of Braun's polygraph were never released. Jeremy and his ex-wife Kim were reportedly on amicable terms when he disappeared, essentially ruling her out as a suspect. She remarried and passed away in 2016. Oddly, Jeremy shared some mutual acquaintances with Aaron Bernard, another Idaho man who vanished in 2004, but there is no evidence suggesting that the two cases are connected. Jeremy had a baby daughter when he disappeared, and his family strongly believes that he would not abandon her. They suspect that foul play is involved and that Jeremy may be dead, and are intent on finding out what happened to their beloved son and brother. Maran Carver. In 2004, a 40-year-old Boston, Massachusetts investment banker named Maran Carver embarked on a week-long cruise from Seattle to Alaska without telling her family. But that wasn't that strange, since she often traveled alone. She seemed excited for the voyage, according to her steward, Domingo Monteiro, who explained that she ordered room service instead of going to the dining room. Maran was last seen on the second day of the cruise, when Monteiro delivered food to her cabin. The next morning, Monteiro discovered that Maran's bed had not been slept in. Her belongings were still there, along with a tip and an envelope with unknown contents. The employee repeatedly reported Maran's disappearance to his supervisor, who told Monteiro to just do his job. After the cruise, the supervisor promptly donated Maran's clothing to charity and put the rest of her belongings into storage. Nobody reported her missing, and the cruise company finally notified the FBI of Maran's disappearance 5 weeks later. Try not to let anything happen to you on a cruise. The contents of the envelope left behind in her cabin were never released. Maran's family was not surprised that she traveled without telling anyone, but they were baffled by how difficult it was for them to obtain information about her disappearance, leading them to suspect a cover-up on the cruise company's behalf. In response to this allegation, the company suggested that perhaps Maran, who had a history of depression, committed suicide by jumping overboard. But Maran had only boarded with 1 outfit and 2 handbags, which were all found in her cabin, meaning that Maran would have had to walk to the deck in her underwear, according to true crime writer J.H. Moncrief. Maran's family sued the cruise line and received a small settlement, but her disappearance remained shrouded in mystery. Her father, who pioneered the movement for justice for Maran, sadly passed away without ever learning what happened to her. Stephen Kocher. After leaving his St. George, Utah home on December 12, 2009, a devout 30-year-old Mormon named Stephen Kocher told some friends over text message that he was heading to Las Vegas. He was last seen alive the following day on home surveillance footage, captured 140 miles away in Henderson, Nevada. The strange video shows Stephen parking his Chevy Cavalier in a cul-de-sac and calmly walking away from the vehicle with something tucked under his arm. Inside the car, police found Christmas gifts Stephen had purchased for his family, along with some personal belongings. His cell phone and wallet were missing, however, and his cell signal was picked up at various locations for the next several days before it was lost. Stephen was originally from Texas and grew up in Salt Lake City before moving to St. George. He had no known connections to Henderson or the Las Vegas area, leaving his loved ones and the authorities equally perplexed about what he was doing there when he vanished. Drug and alcohol use are against Stephen's Mormon faith, and he does not appear disoriented or upset in the footage that shows him deserting his car. Maybe he wanted to disappear? His family does not believe that he committed suicide. All they or anyone else can do is speculate regarding Stephen's disappearance and hope that they someday finally gain closure. Hatis Korbasioglu. Turkish immigrant Hatis Korbasioglu was last seen on June 13, 2009 in Toronto, Canada, when she left to visit her married boyfriend, Reza Kosa, in New York. The 32-year-old was never heard from again, and her family's attempts to reach her through Kosa were unsuccessful, with the man reportedly changing his story whenever Korbasioglu's relatives called and questioned her whereabouts. Kosa eventually stopped communicating with the missing woman's family altogether. Korbasioglu's car was found abandoned at JFK Airport, and her cell phone and bank account showed no recent activity. There are unconfirmed sightings of her in Turkey, but no official record of her ever entering the country exists, leading investigators to believe that she never left New York. The following year, Kosa, a Turkish refugee who lived in the Long Island suburb of Hicksville, became a suspect in the murder of his wife, Winsome Angela Perez. Perez's body was found stuffed in a bag and dumped at a factory where Kosa once worked as a welder. By then, Kosa had taken a one-way flight to Turkey. He committed suicide shortly thereafter by jumping from a 9-story building, leaving behind an ominous note about how he made the biggest mistake of his life by falling in love with a Canadian woman who knew about his wife and was under the false impression that the couple planned to divorce. Did Hatis suffer a similar tragic fate to that of Kosa's wife? All signs point toward it, but evidence remains virtually non-existent. Thanks for watching. Be safe out there and be very careful and aware the next time you're on a cruise especially. Would you like to hear more mysterious cases? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!